This is a game called Htwo Swing. It's a fairly simple game. It's like a first-person perspective game where you use a grappling hook to swing from objects in the environment that are mostly inspired by the vaporwave aesthetic. For what it is, this game's pretty fun. The game isn't that long, but it doesn't really need to be that long. It explores all of the cool mechanics it has to offer in the number of levels that it gives you. And it never feels bogged down by levels that feel repetitive, like they didn't really need to be there. But although I enjoyed this game, there is one pretty large criticism that I have for this game. It has a little bit of an identity crisis towards the end of the game. The game suddenly forgets what it was meant to be. What do I mean by this? Well, there are 5 worlds in the game, and each world has 20 levels. The first 4 levels are super fun. They slowly add to the challenge and continuously add new mechanics and ideas to the levels to keep the game feeling fresh. But then we reach the 5th world, the Crimson Court, and it starts off okay. The first 10 to 15 levels are the hardest levels you've seen so far, but they're following the trajectory of the other levels that came before it. But then all of a sudden, the last 5 levels are 10 times harder than anything else that came before it for seemingly no reason. Completely out of nowhere, the game goes from a casual yet challenging game that keeps players on their toes to a grueling gauntlet that has little to no room for error whatsoever. It went from Super Mario to Dark Souls in the blink of an eye for literally no reason. Now don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with a game being hard. There's plenty of difficult games out there that I love. The problem with Htwo Swing is not that it's too difficult, but that its difficulty curve isn't very consistent. A difficulty curve is essentially the difficulty of a game plotted out onto a graph. The y-axis is difficulty, and the x-axis is time. It's difficulty across the progression of the game. A good difficulty curve will look something like this. A curve that's too steep may cause the game to get harder faster than most players can keep up with. Not steep enough, and the player gets bored because they're not being challenged by what the game keeps throwing at them. Difficulty curves that have sudden spikes in them can throw off a game's pacing and make a player become frustrated, feeling like they haven't had time to get good enough to overcome what's being thrown at them. Difficulty curves with decreases in difficulty can work in certain scenarios, but if done incorrectly or unintentionally, it will cause more pacing issues and can make a player feel bored of the later stages of the game. Htwo Swing's difficulty curve was steadily climbing along like this, then suddenly in the last 5 levels it goes like this, for no reason, and it doesn't really make much sense. Htwo Swing's last levels, being as difficult as they are, could have been fine if the rest of the game's difficulty was raised to match it. If the difficulty curve was up here the entire time, then I would have no complaints, but it started off very low, and very spontaneously became extremely challenging. At the time of writing, I have 5.7 hours in this game. Roughly 2.5 of those hours were spent in the last 2 levels of the game. About 20 minutes of those hours was spent recording footage for this video. The difficulty curve not only completely changed what the game was meant to be, but it also caused a very serious pacing issue, where I went from rapidly completing levels to being stuck on a single level for multiple hours at a time. And that change in pace was extremely sudden. A game's difficulty curve is something that, when done well, won't even occur to you, but when it's done poorly, it will impact every facet of the game. Once again, making your game easier doesn't guarantee a good difficulty curve. It's about the difficulty of the game in relation to past and future levels in the game's progression. There are quite a few games that I come back to again and again on this channel. For example, I've talked about Rain World in dozens of my videos, but this game, to my dismay, is not perfect. This game, in my opinion, can have some really weird difficulty curve issues. If I was to try and plot out Rain World's difficulty curve, it would look something like this. You might disagree with me, but hear me out. Rain World's biggest strength is forcing the player to learn everything on their own. The game gives you very little information to go off of. Even basic game mechanics aren't taught to the player, so the player has to figure them out on their own. If you have absolutely no idea what's going on, Rain World is completely ruthless. The different enemies all behave differently, and understanding how they behave is vital to being able to avoid them or defeat them. You don't have any idea where to go, and even when you do reach a Karma Gate, you probably don't know how to open it. Each time you progress to a new area, you are confronted with new enemies with different behaviours and skills that they use to hunt you with. The game's difficulty starts very high because you lack the knowledge to successfully navigate through the world. But once you begin to learn that knowledge, the game's difficulty descends and starts climbing in a much more traditional way. Another game with a difficulty curve similar to this is Hades by Supergiant Games. The Mirror of Night in Hades acts as a way to give your character permanent upgrades. On your very first run, you haven't gotten any upgrades from the mirror, meaning that not only do you lack the skill and knowledge to fight through the enemies, but you're also literally weaker than you would be if you had already played for about 10 hours. Some of the upgrades, like literally having extra lives in your run, are vital to being able to succeed in a normal run. There's nothing objectively wrong with having a difficulty curve that looks like this. These two games are awesome after all, but it makes the new player experience a lot more grueling than it would have been otherwise. Games with difficulty settings will have multiple difficulty curves all at the same time. The difficulty curve in Halo 3 looks something like this. I have a whole other video talking about difficulty settings, so I won't go into too much depth. There's a link in the sidebar. But the too long didn't watch version is that difficulty settings make it hard for a new player to get into your game. Someone with little experience in video games in general might find this curve to be the most appealing, but a hardcore monster guzzling gamer might want to choose this one. But neither of these players actually know which difficulty is best suited to them, because the game asks them to pick their difficulty before they've played a single second of gameplay. Multiplayer games don't really have difficulty curves, because the difficulty curve of a multiplayer match isn't carefully crafted by the developer like it would be in a single player game. The difficulty of a multiplayer game is entirely dependent on the skill of your opponent and the skill of your teammates if applicable. But multiplayer games have learning curves, and learning curves are basically the same concept, just framed in a slightly different way. If a difficulty curve is difficulty over time, then a learning curve is the skill of the player over how much experience that they have. Team Fortress 2's learning curve is pretty brutal. TF2's learning curve looks a little bit like this. You spend a ton of time playing the game, but still suck despite this experience, because the game is so bad at teaching you what you need to know. But as you continue playing and maybe go look on the internet for external resources to help you out, you start to improve drastically. And then you plateau, as your higher level of skill makes any improvements you make much smaller and less significant overall. But what causes this? Well, the tutorial mode is extremely lackluster, telling you only the very basics of the game, and they only have tutorials for 4 of the 9 classes. The tutorial mode was also bugged for about 6 years straight, where it literally wouldn't open, so any new players that came around during that time period literally couldn't even use the tutorials. And if you've ever played TF2 for an extensive period of time, you'll know all too well that half of the players in any server have absolutely no idea what's going on at all. TF2 has over 150 unlockable weapons, dozens of game modes, dozens of maps, all the 9 classes interact with each other in unique ways, half the classes have subclasses that completely change their kits, the casual servers don't match you into games based on your skill level, and the community servers tab is full to the brim of trade and achievement servers that will literally rot the brains of any new player that sets foot on them. The game's learning curve is so steep because the game has so much depth, but the game does almost nothing to attempt to teach new players about any of this depth. Their best hope is looking on YouTube at community-made guides, most of which will be outdated. TF2's learning curve is brutal. Intricate game mechanics like rocket jumping are only really able to be learned via external resources on the internet, or through asking people in-game and hoping that they help you. Competitive games tend to have very steep learning curves in general. Fighting games, MOBAs, and class-based shooters all suffer from the issue of a steep learning curve. These games offer so much depth in their gameplay, but that depth comes with a sacrifice. The more complex your game is, the more someone needs to learn before they can play at an even remotely competent level. That's what causes this issue right here, where you're stuck sinking hours of time into a game without making much drastic improvement. You can spend 10 hours trying to learn how to play League of Legends, and still have almost no idea how to play League of Legends. And most of your external resources like guides on YouTube are teaching players about concepts like wave manipulation and lane priority, concepts that are far too complex for a new player to understand or even need to know. This turns away casual players really fast. Much like a difficulty curve like this risks turning off casual players in a single player game. The difficulty curve in a game is something that's very difficult to get right. If it was as simple as drawing these graphs, then we would have no issues, but the difficulty curve is entirely based off of how your game and its mechanics react with a player base. The best way to get a good difficulty curve is to rigorously playtest a game, but not every developer can afford to do this. And some of my favourite games out there have weird and wacky difficulty curves that impact the game in different ways. But it's hard to say that the difficulty curves in those games didn't heavily impact my perception of the game, even if I ended up enjoying them. Thanks for watching.